Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is John Hamre. I'm the president at CSIS and delighted to welcome you today for what I think is going to be a very important conversation with the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Chairman Adam Smith. And it's a real privilege that we have this opportunity to talk with him. He's involved in the mighty efforts of trying to get the National Defense Authorization Act through the Congress. And so he's given us this window, and I'm very grateful that he found time to be able to do that. And special thanks to Rebecca Hersman, who's been guiding this along the way from our end and bringing us together. And so she will be leading the conversation with the chairman. I would just like to begin by saying Chairman Smith has thought about these issues more deeply than any other member of Congress that I know right now. I mean, this has been something, and I've had numerous conversations with him, because we're confronting a wide range of issues now, and they're in many ways they're more fresh than ever. Yes, the role of nuclear weapons that they play in international security has changed a lot, but there is still an enormous role that they play in national security calculations for us, for our primary competitors, and now for many other countries that we worry about. We're seeing a rise of some significant investments in nuclear systems, and of course that always has controversy attached with it. There is, and I know in the NDAA that's soon to be approved, there's calling for increased oversight over the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, over pit production. So there's a whole range of issues that are important here. And we're also literally, I think probably 2 weeks after the inauguration, we see the expiration of a major, probably the last arms control agreement with the Russians. And they have undertaken enormously impressive, worrying investments over the last 5 to 6 years. So there's a huge set of issues that Chairman Smith has been wrestling with and trying to help guide the Congress to think about. And it's our privilege today to be able to hear his thinking about this. I'm going to just want to say everyone knows Adam Smith, but it's under his tenure that the committee has developed new vigor and new energy, and it's been very impressive to watch his stewardship. So I think we should turn right now to you, Chairman Smith. But let me get Rebecca, you're going to formally launch the conversation, and you know best what we're doing from here. Let me turn it to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamre, much appreciated, and welcome to everyone who's with us today. My name is Rebecca Hersman. I am the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS, and we are really thrilled to have you here with us, Chairman Smith, to talk through a whole range of nuclear issues. 1 minute of housekeeping for all of those who are participating today. First of all, the conversation is on the record. A recording will be made and will be available at the event page in the coming days. To have the best viewer experience, we encourage you to use the gallery view. We will be taking questions in addition to some of the questions that were posted ahead of time. Remember to submit your questions via the Q&A function in the webinar. That's the best way for me to get them and see them and pull them into the conversation when we turn to that. I'll ask that you please include your name and affiliation with your question. I try to identify the questioner wherever I possibly can. So we will we'll kind of work it that way. So really thrilled to have you all here, and especially you, Mr. Chairman. If you don't mind, we'll just dive right in.
Absolutely.
Having such a big week. The House passed the NDAA this week with 335 votes. And is awaiting final action in the Senate.
My staff just texted me, actually, and if it's to be accurate, it says the Senate passed it at 84-13.
Well, that's
So,
exciting.
yeah,
Hopefully we're a good omen for you, sir.
yeah. So it's a start to the morning.
Yeah, that is good news indeed. Well, my understanding is the bill fully authorizes funding for the Trump administration's request for nuclear modernization funding, including the ground-based strategic deterrent, the replacement for our current land leg of the nuclear triad. You have in the past raised some reservations about the GBSD program. So I wanted to ask you about this. You know, as we move squarely into the bow wave stage of nuclear modernization, what is your take on the future of the triad as the basis for our nuclear posture? Where do you see consensus? Where do you see disagreement? And in particular, with our ground-based strategic deterrent?
Well, I think there's a couple broad ways to separate out this issue as we move into the Biden administration. First of all, there is considerable disagreement within the Democratic Party about the future of what our military national security policy ought to be going forward. And there was a growing, and this is frankly, part of what was reflected on the right as well within Trump supporters, but also within the Democratic Party. And part of the angst that's out there amongst, I guess, sort of left-leaning activists in the Democratic Party as they see the Biden national security team, the so-called the blob is back, if you will, which is of course horribly unfair, but but sort of the consensus of our foreign policy approach. There's a strong feeling amongst Democrats that consensus has led us to rely too much on the military, both in terms of how the military is engaged in the world and the number of places, as is pointed out. I mean, the Obama administration did a lot more drone strikes than the Bush administration did. They were much more active in doing missions against terrorists in far-flung places of the world, even than the Bush administration. And then on the size of the defense budget, on the degree to which, when we look at the global challenges of peace, security, there is, strong opinions amongst Democrats and many on the right as well, that too much of that goes into the military. That, when you look at the pandemic issues, when you look at climate change, alliances, that we are focused too much on the military. And then that comes down to the nuclear issues as being part of that. And a general feeling that the size of the US military and the aggressive engagement of the US military is making the world a more dangerous place. And we need to pull back. And that has a whole bunch of implications in terms of, well, the global war on terror, as we stopped calling it a while ago, but that's basically what it is. Number one, and then number two, great power competition. The folks who are concerned about excessive use of the military are not comforted by the fact that we've decided that we focus too much on terrorism, that we need to pivot to great power competition, because they see us pivoting to a new Cold War, a dangerous arms race that could lead to a conflict. And that plays out in a whole bunch of areas. Within nuclear weapons, the concern is the more we build, the more we get into an arms race, the more dangerous and likely it is that we will come into conflict with China and Russia, and the danger that conflict becomes nuclear. That's the concern, and it's a very legitimate concern. So how do we mitigate that? Now, I think sometimes the mitigation of that is, well, the US just needs to build less nuclear weapons. Obviously, if there was no such thing as nuclear weapons, that would be great. They'd be gone from the world. We wouldn't have to worry about it, but you can't unring the bell. So the way to look at our nuclear posture, I think, is we have to have an adequate deterrent. The goal of our nuclear weapons policy should be one thing and one thing only: to make sure there never is a nuclear conflict. And part of that requires us having a sufficient deterrent that Russia and China don't think that they can launch nuclear weapons and get away with it. Now, the arms control aspect of this is incredibly important, because there are new technologies are changing the game here. Hypersonics, there are all kinds of new developments. Missile defense. How effective is missile defense? Because when you're trying to calculate, I need to have this many weapons to guarantee that we can deter someone from attacking us. If they attack us, no matter how badly they hit us, we'll hit them just as bad. They won't want to do it. Heck, you get into command and control and cyber. If somebody develops, a cyber technique where they can flick a switch and shut off our ability to launch any nuclear weapons, then they're going to think they can get away with it. And what this means is we have to enter into robust discussions with China and with Russia to try to prevent that outcome. It's a major shift in all of that. In my humble opinion, we're building more weapons than we need. And we need to look at ways to have a robust deterrent in a more cost-effective manner. And that's what we're going to work towards. Final thing I'll say on this is that's my vision. It is not a vision that is supported by a majority of members of the House or the Senate or a majority of the American people at this point. You know, the American people are painfully easy to scare. Let's just put it that way. And one thing they're scared of is Russia and China, you know, outdoing us in nuclear weapons and being able to get an upper hand and obliterating us. So when people come along and say, you know, it's John F. Kennedy's fictional missile gap all over again. If we don't have an adequate deterrent, we're vulnerable. So we have to do a low yield nuclear weapon. We have to replace the ICBM. We have to build more bombers. So that argument right now is carrying the day. And what I want to try to do is start a more robust argument about what a more cost-effective, safer approach might look like.
Thank you. Do you have any particular areas there that you think are most promising, where you would like to see focused, more examination of where those reductions could be made?
Well, I think the most promising aspect is just the fact that people don't want to spend more money than we have to. We got a massive debt, a massive deficit. Frankly, even within DOD, now, like I said, you've got this broad argument where people want to spend less on defense, but even the people who don't necessarily want to spend less on defense, they want to build more ships, they want to build more planes. And the more money you're spending on nuclear weapons, the less money you have for this other stuff. So the most promising aspect is the cost-effective approach, is to make the case that we can meet our needs in nuclear weapons in an affordable way that frees up more money for other things. Now, people will get into an epic food fight over where to spend that extra money. But as a starting point, there are a lot of people who would like to have it. And I guess that's the most promising. As far as the individual weapon systems right now, nothing's terribly promising. Because again, the overarching opinion that has carried the day, I mean, it was Obama's nuclear posture review that launched us on this road. President Trump enhanced it, to be sure, but it was a bipartisan consensus that said we need to build what we're planning on building. So at the moment, I don't see any aspect of that that's promising in terms of being able to convince people who don't need to do it. We got to build the argument. You got to make the argument and you got to build support for it.
Okay, great. So we've talked a little bit about the hardware side of things. There's kind of a software, or the kind of what we think about declaratory policy and other things. That's a really important area, getting a lot of attention. The Trump administration's NPR seemed to kind of open the aperture a little bit on the range of circumstances under which nuclear weapons could be considered. You and Senator Warren had previously introduced legislation on a no first use policy for nuclear weapons. And the Democratic platform and some statements by the president-elect suggest a desired movement to a sole purpose doctrine. I do other work working with our European allies and partners and some in Asia. There's quite a bit of angst about this direction and concern about among some of the allies in its implications for extended deterrence. So I'm just wondering, what does your crystal ball tell you there? How do you see that part of our policy going forward? And how do you think we could navigate that with partners and allies?
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity there. By the way, I should say, I think on that Senate vote I was telling you about, the Senate always confuses me. I think that was the vote to have the vote. They haven't actually taken the vote yet. The Senate's a weird place. So that was the vote basically to block the filibuster and move forward. So apparently they're going to vote here shortly. Now, and I think this is an area of promise because I think we should have a no first use policy. And I'm sorry, I know that the basic doctrine on weapons is, don't tell your enemies what you're not going to use. And by and large, I kind of agree with that. You keep all options on the table. Make sure that you keep your enemies off balance. I think nuclear weapons are a special case. I think they are a weapon unlike any other weapon, and I don't think that's actually debatable. They're the one weapon that could absolutely destroy the planet. I think we should have a clear policy on nuclear weapons, and it's what I stated at the outset. We have the nuclear weapons we have to make sure that nobody ever uses them. And if that is your message, if that is the basis of our interactions with other nuclear powers like Russia and China and North Korea and Pakistan and India for that matter, if that is our clear policy, then it doesn't make sense to say, but we're going to keep our options open. Yeah, who knows? Maybe if something happens, we'll be the first ones to use nukes. I think we should fight that battle and make it clear why that policy is important.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll go to a slightly different direction, in terms of how might the next administration come to making some of these decisions or recommendations to Congress. It seems likely, hard to imagine that a Biden administration would not want to undertake its own review of nuclear weapons policy and posture, much like the last 4 administrations. But there have been some questions about how best to do that, whether a kind of singularly focused nuclear posture review is the way to do that. On the one hand, those reviews tend to take a while, usually over a year. And the budget process is moving much more quickly than that. There have been questions about how to shorten that timeline so that you could have a policy-informed budget, including into the next cycle, but hard to do in a traditional posture review. There's also been a concern raised about, how many different reviews and how to do missile threats here and cyber here and space there, nuclear weapons there, and then broad security and strategy overall. So there's been some consideration of perhaps a much more integrated approach. Do you have any views on that? What recommendations you might give to kind of prioritize that process and make sure that budgets and policies and kind of come together with that sort of review and guidance?
Yeah, I think that's a very tricky set of issues to deal with. But I think the way the president-elect has to deal with that is right now he has to issue, if you will, preliminary findings. All right. Because like you said, he's rolling into a budget, things are happening. And frankly, much of the impact that he can have, as we know, is in the first couple of years before, the next election starts coming around. So I think, both in terms of our national security strategy and in terms of our nuclear posture review, there should be initial opinions expressed by the Biden administration, by his incoming national security team. And I think they should state as their goal some of those basic shifts that I just described. And then, yes, also put in place the process to go through, hopefully we can do it in 6 months instead of a year, a broader review. And I think personally, it starts with the national defense strategy. You can't just do the nuclear posture review. You got to look at the whole picture. And that gets into the budget, what our goals, what objectives are, how we're going to make some fundamental shifts. So I think the most important thing that the Biden administration needs to do, well, 2 things. One, that short term, here's how we're going to fundamentally shift some of our ideas on nuclear posture and on the national defense strategy, and put in place the system to get a comprehensive look at it done in the first 6 to 9 months of his administration. I think there is a pretty strong appetite out there for, moving away from our excessive militarization of our foreign policy. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for President-elect Biden to, come up with a new national defense strategy that makes sense on that front. And that gets me to a long thing about the budget aspect of this. And I just think, and this is my great hope for the new administration, is that we can get off of this idea that the more money we spend, the better off we are. The more ships we build, the more planes we build. It just drives me absolutely insane. Like when they came out with the 500 ship Navy, I literally laughed in their face when they told me that. Because what the hell does that mean? 500 ships for what purpose? What is the capability of what you're trying to do? And the big thing, I think, going forward is to focus on not being able to beat our adversaries in an all-out war, but to deter them from walking into that all-out war in the first place. And frankly, when you look at the conflicts that have happened, where, Russia has been involved in the Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, others were involved in the Armenian-Azerbaijan fight, it's really less expensive technology that's the key to winning. Essentially, the key is you have to be able to find your opponent before they find you, shut down their systems before they shut yours down. You can have 75 aircraft carriers, and if someone can flick a switch and shut them down, it doesn't really matter. So we can shift our focus in that way and have a more cost-effective, less belligerent military that makes the world a safer place, in my view. Now, that takes a fundamental shift because, as you know, the Pentagon, the whole national security establishment, they are built to just do more, build more. And it's like, the Air Force came out with a study at the start of this year saying that we need 25% more air wings. And again, I'm like, okay, wonderful. You're not getting 25% more air wings, not on this planet. So what's exactly is the point of you saying that you quote unquote need them? You'd better not need them or we're all screwed. So let's figure out a way to actually do a national security policy that fits within a budget, makes sense. That's the vision that has to be developed over time. In the short term, I think the administration needs to put out a couple of quick markers. We're going to re-engage with the world. We're going to build more partnerships. We're going to focus more on diplomacy, more on development, and we're going to get off of the idea of winning a nuclear war and declare a no first use policy. I think there are some things they can do in the short term as they build to that larger narrative.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I've got a couple more areas I'm going to open up some questions on. I'm encouraging people to put their questions in the chat. I'll try to bring those in as we go. And some of the questions we got ahead of time, so I have a few of those. But I want to make sure we go ahead and dive into some of the arms control questions. I know such an important area. Without an extension, you start. The last bilateral arms control treaty between the United States and Russia will expire on the 5th of February. And it appears any immediate negotiations under the current administration have stalled. The incoming administration will have only a couple of weeks to come to an agreement. What do you see as the way ahead? And do you expect that the administration will encounter any rough spots within Congress if they pursue an extension, perhaps a full 5-year extension without a lot of preconditions or other issues? They're more of a clean extension. Do you think that will run into problems, or do you think that seems like a strong possibility?
Well, it's guaranteed to run into problems. The question is, are those problems significant enough to derail the plan? It's not going to come as any surprise to anybody that there are going to be a fair number of Republicans in the Senate and the House who are going to oppose absolutely every word that comes out of Joe Biden's mouth from now until he ceases to be president. That is their overarching strategy. So yeah, I would think there would be some problems in building the sufficient bipartisan support in this. How big those problems grow to, I don't know. But let's not underestimate the power of the extremists within the Republican Party. We just got 107 members of Congress just signed on to ending our democracy as we know it because President Trump asked them to. That's a little frightening. I'm referring to the lawsuit, that basically says, you 4 states, you didn't vote the way we wanted to. We want our guy to win, so we're going to toss out your elections. 107 members of Congress said, yeah, I'm up for that. So yeah, I think there's going to be a bit of a problem with whatever President Biden tries to do. And if he tries to extend START, they're going to come up with some argument as to why it's unilateral surrender and the end of the world as we know it, and it's terrible and we can't have it. Ultimately, I would think that if he presents it as something's better than nothing, we're going to re-engage in negotiations. And the Trump administration, as you know, was actively engaged in negotiations right up to the very end to try and get a new START extension. So I think, the correct plan at this point is extend it, go into negotiations. Now, negotiations are very tough right now because, Russia is in a different place and China's not at the table. And I think that's a legitimate point. China is a rising power. Their nuclear arsenal, their missiles are a huge factor in what we're going to do. And if we do an agreement with Russia, but how does that affect our relationship with China? I think we should make efforts to try to pull them all into it, but none of that's going to be easy. But it's certainly easier if we have an agreement on the books than if we just let it go. So I would push for short-term extension. And get back and try to negotiate a longer term deal.
One of the things that's been challenging with arms control generally is, everybody sort of wants to make connections, conditions, linkages. There's been a traditional one over the last, 10 years or so about linking nuclear modernization with arms control, and whether or not that has been a positive or a negative linkage, I'd like to ask you about. But relatedly, there's been a new one that's been kind of brought in by the current administration on the extent to which we really have to directly link arms control with China to arms control with Russia. A lot of views on that in terms of whether that is a constructive way forward. Any views on those two types of linkages there?
Yeah, obviously, I think they both make sense. But then the question is, if China says thanks, but no thanks, does that mean we just from the table with Russia? No, I don't think so. But I think it does bring in that complication. I'd say, the two big complications are one, China is now, should be part of this discussion because of how they've grown as both a military and economic power. But then the second thing is the new technologies. Again, all of this, is based on this, that you have nuclear weapons because you're afraid that the other side could overwhelm you. And if you don't have an adequate deterrent, that's how we stumble into the nuclear war. If one side starts mistakenly think that they can win it. And new technologies change the equation. This is why Russia was rightfully so paranoid about our development of missile defense. If you can build a system that theoretically can knock out the incoming missiles. And by the way, I'm not a technological expert in this area, but everything I've seen about it, I'm banking on that. All right. Because, there's all kinds of different ways. Even when we do the tests, when we know it's coming, when we're prepared for it, our hit ratio is not 100%. So you got to believe, I wouldn't rely on that. And then there's the idea of, low yield nuclear weapons and short weapons, the idea to do a quote tactical nuclear weapon. And how does that change the equation? So all those things have to be on the table. We have to think about this in one straightforward way. What can we negotiate between each other where we are both guaranteed that we have an adequate nuclear deterrent so that any side launching a nuclear weapon in their own death warrant, mutually assured destruction. Terrifying as it is, that's the goal. How do technologies change that? How, hypersonic weapons, can they get there so quick that you don't have an adequate? How do we ensure that there is that balance? And I think that is the spirit of the negotiations that we need to enter into. China should be part of that, and we should keep pushing for that, but we should not do it if they're not involved.
Okay, thank you. One more question from me, and I'm going to start pulling in questions from the audience. I wanted to ask about the JCPOA. That will also be on the new administration's agenda. Trying to reset a policy regarding JCPOA withdrawal will be tricky. The role of sanctions will be a major topic in the next administration. That one is also very thorny on Capitol Hill. Do you have any advice for navigating that space and how that might best be dealt with?
Yeah, I think in a very straightforward way, we should reinstitute the JCPOA. And it's not that I'm unmindful of how bad Iran is, but when you look at the big picture, the main reason that we got out of the JCPOA is because of the concerns, well, in terms of like a substantive argument, aside from the politics of Obama did it, therefore it's bad. The substantive argument was that it didn't address Iran's other bad behavior. That Iran is messing around in Yemen, they're messing around in Lebanon and Iraq and Syria, and they are a bad actor all the way around. We just let that go. There was also a bunch of arguments about that, frankly, were just 100% dishonest about how the JCPOA didn't really stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It absolutely did. And there was just a lot of lies that were told about that. So for all that stuff going on, we're better off if Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. And that's what the JCPOA accomplished. As far as their regional bad behavior is bad. Is it worth letting Iran become a nuclear power to try to address it? No, it is not. And by the way, since we've pulled out of the JCPOA, it's not like Iran has stopped all that other stuff either. Killing Soleimani set them back a little bit, but it hasn't stopped them. I'm very involved in what's going on in Yemen. They're still pumping weapons and people into Yemen, backing up the Houthis to keep that fight going. They're still screwing around with Lebanon and Syria. So it ain't changing that behavior. So us pulling out of the JCPOA isn't going to stop that. The only thing that's going to stop that is if the people in the region put the pressure on them to make it contrary to their best interests. And frankly, that's starting to happen. The alliance that is building between the Arab states and Israel to confront Iran is going to make it more difficult for Iran to be a bad actor in the region. We should be supportive of that. I think we should work to build alliances with the UAE, hopefully get Saudi Arabia to a better place where we can work with them, encourage the relationships that are developing between Israel and the Gulf states as a deterrence on Iran's bad behavior. None of that should get us out of the JCPOA. Okay, so if we go back to JCPOA, does it make Iran will have more money? It's absolutely true. Okay. And that will enable them a little bit more to do a little bit more of that bad behavior in the region. I don't think it is an order of magnitude worth going the other way. It's just not. It's not. They're still going to be doing it. They're going to be doing it with a little bit more money. They got all kinds of economic problems at home that they're going to have to deal with. I just think focusing on, can we get a deal that makes sure that Iran isn't developing a nuclear weapon is more than worth it, regardless of what else is going on.
Okay, thank you. Makes sense. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that have been coming in, and I'm going to be grouping them in the best I can, as I, for those of you out there in the internet land here, trying to link some of them together so I can get through as many as possible. We actually had 3 questions. We're all very similar, moving to another part of the world, North Korea. And Liz Kim from VOA Korea Service, Young Kim from the Radio Free Asia, Jess Martin, a graduate student, all asked about North Korea's growing missile threat and continued nuclear weapons development, and want to know, how worried are you about this? What do you think are the most important next steps? How do we try to kind of, right the course here in some way better than the situation we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, I'm very worried about it. And there's no pithy solution to this. I mean, we've got, 5 presidents now that have tried. And if it was easy, one of them would have figured it out. And it's basically, I mean, the end result that we want is we want a denuclearized North Korea. That's what we want. I don't personally see a path towards that at the moment. Kim Jong-un is, not walking away from power. The regime that he has, even if he dies, he's not walking away from power. Got to respect the guy's ability to fake his own death and get international attention, by the way. So yeah, it's a factor we're going to deal with. So the question, how do we handle it as it is? And nobody likes the word containment. I don't know. I'm more modest in my expectations of the world that I'm living in than most. But the idea that accepting something other than total victory is not. That's the way the world works sometimes. Sometimes you do the best you can, and the best we can right now is to try to contain the threat out of North Korea. So how do we do that? Number one, the alliance with South Korea is really important. I am deeply worried about all of this talk about pulling troops out of South Korea, insisting that they pay more. That partnership is enormously important as a deterrent to North Korea doing anything. Now, they may build more missiles, they may advance their nuclear technology, but whether or not they actually engage in armed conflict, that is a huge point of demarcation that we want to try to stop. And one of the ways we stop that is by showing a strong alliance with South Korea that shows that if North Korea does thing, they're done, they're gone. You can go ahead and rattle all the sabers they want, but if they start swinging them around, they're out of business. And I think maintaining that relationship with Korea is crucial. Building and strengthening alliances throughout the region. It's a complicated place. Japan and South Korea have many differences, and in addition to many, common threats. So how do we continue to work with them and just build a strong alliance down there that shows North Korea that we're not walking away, we're not budging, and going to get away with any actual military activity is going to be important. And then, that gets us into a long conversation about China, which I won't get into, but we need to deal with our relationship with China in a way that helps to encourage them to see containing the North Korean threat as in their interests as well.
There's a lot of questions that are coming in over the chat, and some that came earlier that have a lot to do with the NNSA part of the nuclear weapons enterprise. I'm actually going to try to link a few of them together just so that you can respond to several in turn. Of course, there's the issue of the W93, which is a new, I think it's the first in quite a long time, new number designated warhead that was proposed by the Trump administration, and which is also quite linked to the UK program and has raised a lot of concerns with them. I have a question in from Jessica Bland, relatedly, looking at posture and life extension type programs and how that works. So if you could comment on that. My understanding is that it's fully funded in terms of the authorization bill, but has run into some bumps with the appropriators. Similar questions have come in from a couple of people on the pit production question, including Tom Clements from the Savannah River Site Watch, who wants to ask you about the two plutonium pit production and whether or not how you feel about that and whether you see that going forward. So two of sort of the programmatic elements, and then I'll come back to a comment from Dan Leone, who's asking about more of the bureaucratic structures between DOD and NNSA and oversight. So there's a lot there.
There's a ton of ground to cover here. Let me do my best. First of all, we need to modernize our nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. They've been around for a long time. We have to make sure they work. Pit production is a huge part of this. NNSA plays a huge role in this. Even my more modest view of our nuclear weapon structure should be, there is no question that we need to modernize our nuclear weapons work. It's incredibly important. I am highly skeptical of the level of competence within the NNSA. Now, I could be wrong about that. I've been to Savannah River, I've been to Los Alamos, I've talked with them a lot. It seems to me that over the last 30 or 40 years, starting with the whole pit production thing falling apart in Colorado, which is a long, complicated Byzantine story of how that came to be. There's just been a series of somewhat incompetent missteps within the way the NNSA has modernized this stuff. Now, I will temper those comments because I know I will get letters over that one. But to say that it is possible Congress did not play the most productive role in this, because the thing that really sticks in my craw on this basic competency issue is the Savannah River site and the MOX facility. Okay, that is pretty close to white collar crime. All right, we came up with this idea that, and look, I think Savannah River is enormously important. I think maintaining these sites and the expertise that they have is important. Their mission shifted. They were looking at losing a lot of jobs. So how can we keep them going? One of the ideas was, and also we have all this plutonium floating around that we'd like to do something with. So wouldn't it be great if we could convert it into fuel for nuclear reactors? Cool. And I confess, I was on the committee. I didn't know a lot about this until I sort of figured it out later. Only problem is the fuel that they were talking about creating doesn't work in any nuclear reactors that we have in the United States, or quite frankly, that we were ever going to build. And this became obvious at some point. It also became equally obvious that even if we were able to do this, even if you were able to repurpose this facility in such a way that it could make this fuel, there was no place to send it. It just wasn't going to. Long after we knew that, we spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 to $6 billion essentially digging a hole and then refilling it and then digging it again and then refilling it. And I went and visited the building, and it's a pretty cool looking building. It's not done yet, obviously, but and we don't really have $5 or $6 billion in the nuclear enterprise to just go flinging around for no particular purpose. So now they come to me and they say, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the MOX facility and we're going to turn it into a place that builds pits. Okay, like it used to be a bowling alley, but now it's going to be a restaurant. And when you're talking about nuclear material, it's a little bit more complicated than the analogy I just described. So I am highly skeptical that they're going to be able to turn that building into an effective pit production facility. Highly skeptical. And we need the pits, okay? And this is again where, and this is, I think, a pretty good summary of my great frustration within DOD. We say, in the case of pits or in the case of ships, pick your number, we need 30 pits a year. Okay, and then it turns out that we're having a devil of a time making 30 pits a year. We're not sure we're going to hit that goal. So what's our solution? We're going to do 80 pits a year. I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? Okay. Well, why don't you figure out how to make the first 30 before you say, well, the way we're going to do this, we're going to blow the whole damn thing up. and start over again. So you're not going to be able to really see that we didn't figure out how to do the first thing. We're going to set a much bigger, larger goal and then say, well, now that we need this many more, it's going to take us another few years, another $1 billion. Isn't that just logical? Because we're building more. Okay. Let's just get something done. All right. Let's just build 300 ships that frickin' work. Okay. Instead of saying, well, we got to have 300, don't do it. Well, let's do this LCS thing. It'll be 3-in-1. It'll be all these other things, and we'll do the DDG 1000 and all that stuff. So now we have all these ships that don't actually frickin' work. And then we come back and say, well, the solution to this is not to build more effectively. Let's say we're going to build 500. Okay. You're sensing my frustration with all this. And I understand where it's coming from, but it's idiotic. And also it is dangerous, because we need the pits. We need to be able to effectively do things. So I am deeply concerned about the NNSAs. Now, it may not be the NNSA's fault. Let me just say that. I understand the politics of this. Everyone's got their interests. And if I'm representing Savannah River, I'm not sure I'm going to walk in there and say, yeah, we're going to lose 2,000 jobs. And that's just the way things bounce. Okay. Now, personally, I would think we could have figured out something more productive to do out of that. But anyway, we got major problems in that area to figure out, okay, what can we do realistically to modernize our nuclear weapons effectively? Now, if we can sift through all of that insanity, look, I think there is a legitimate question to be had as to whether or not we need to build the GBSD. All right. And it's we're working on it. We've been building towards it. People have, is the third leg of the triad absolutely necessary? I'm highly skeptical of this. And right now we haven't really gotten into that conversation because, again, of the politics. I mean, there's a ton of money involved in that weapon system. There's a ton of jobs. The people who have the nuclear, the upper Midwest, South Dakota, North Dakota, wherever the hell it is, they don't want to lose all those jobs. They like being a nuclear target, apparently. And I get all of that, but if we're trying to build a nuclear system within a tight budget that makes sense, these are some of the questions we have to start to answer. And in the last 30 years, the politics has triumphed over any sort of competent policy. And I think we need to work on that. As far as the NNSA budget thing, with whether they report to the Department of Energy, to the Department of Defense, who gets to say when and how we set it up to OMB, I mean, that's fine. I think it's appropriate that the NNSA has a little bit of a say in it before it goes to OMB. But if they're going to have that say, they better not use that say to take $6 billion and dump it down a rat hole in South Carolina. That's what I would argue.
Let me move to a couple of other topics here. There's so many. I'm trying to pull them all in as the best I can.
Covered a lot of ground with that last one, so that's
I did. Okay. Trying to knit that together, although we didn't totally cover that W93.
Oh, sorry. On the W93, I missed that point. It's a tough call, but I think we do need to build it because we do need to modernize the weapon systems. It is a submarine-based system. It's the most survivable. I'd rather build the W93 than the GBSD. Let me just put it that way. It's on the most survivable platform we have, which gives us that credible deterrent. And yes, it is an added bonus that it is enormously important, one of our crucial partners in Great Britain. So I do understand the value of it. We may arguably be a little bit ahead of need on that. I think the appropriators problem, do we need the money right now? I think the UK is pushing a lot of that. Do they need it right now? We need to do it. Do we need to do it right now? That's a tougher question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for hitting on that. There's several questions that, questioners want to ask you about sort of other types of emerging technologies and how they're coming into play. One of our questioners wants to know how you feel about the rise of hypersonics and how much we should invest and how much of a threat it poses. There's another question from Michael Clare about AI-empowered autonomy and thinking about autonomous weapons. So there's several of these that touch on this. Perhaps you kind of think about a couple of those pieces coming together.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most critical questions that we face in defense policy going forward. New technology is very, very difficult. And it's, it's as simple as this, sort of the way I am not an early adapter, because I get used to how I do things. And if it works this way, you give me something else, and then it's like, in fact, just to give you one moronic example. So I still have an iPhone 7 that has that handy dandy little button right down there. As you know, the new iPhones don't have a button because I guess they just have to mess with us and they didn't like the button. So you got to just swipe. All right. So I had to get this new phone to vote in our caucus elections, and I couldn't swipe the damn thing. And then finally somebody showed me, no, you got to start at the bottom. You have to swipe it this way in order to make it. Now, once I figured that out, it's okay, but I don't really want to adapt a new technology that's going to stop me from being able to tie my shoes. All right. Okay. Once I figure it out, then I'll be able to do all this other fancy stuff. But in that gap, it's like, well, I had this, I'm sorry, I will directly get to the point because technology is important. This makes the point. I've been working with Microsoft on this new heads-up display for an infantryman. So basically, you put this thing on, and you can see the satellite images. You can do all this other stuff. And me, I can't even video games that my kids have because they got too many buttons, and it's too confusing. And I was like, the only thing I worry about is, okay, so you're out there, on patrol, and okay, great, I can see over the ridge, and it's 58 degrees, and where I'm going, it looks like it might be raining. And oh my God, the guy in front of me just shot me in the head. So that's probably not a good thing. You can be distracted by all stuff and forget the essential mission. And this is what I think is the problem with technology, and why the way we approach AI and hypersonics is so important. The Eric Clapton song, it's in the way that you use it. All right. It's great technology. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. Are you going to do something with it that actually helps you, or are you going to get buried? Okay. This is what we have got to get better at DoD. We've got to rebuild a more solid relationship with entrepreneurial tech companies, new technology. What I'm thinking about here in all this is the Navy Marine Corps intranet, to give you a more, new technology then was we were able to, big data was going to come together. We can make all of our systems talk to each other. When they talk to each other, they're going to be better. So great, let's do the Navy Marine Corps intranet. Oh my gosh, $12 billion later. Yeah, that doesn't really work. So when we use AI, when we're going to use hypersonics, we have got to be smart about how we use it. Do we use it in a way that advances our interests? And we don't have a choice not to. Okay, if we stick with the 7S because we can't figure out how to swipe, we're dead. Okay, these new technologies are going to be used by somebody. All right, they're going to be implemented in a good way, and if it's not us, we're in serious trouble. But what I want to do is I want to learn from the mistakes of the last 20 years. I mean, look at all, I mentioned the Navy Marine Corps intranet, but I've also mentioned the LCS, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, the Zumwalt class destroyer, the DDG-1000. We've got all these things. Wow, that looks really cool. But, billions of dollars later, it's not helping us. We cannot afford that, which is why I'm working with the Armed Services Committee. We haven't done this, and I'm getting some pushback, so I won't officially announce it, to really have us focus on exactly that question. Okay, how do we use these technologies in a cost-effective way our national security needs, instead of just making some fun toys that are kind of cool to look at? Because I'll tell you, I went up and saw the DDG-1000 up in Bath about 10 years ago. It's wicked cool. I mean, it looks awesome. All right, it just doesn't really do anything for us, and that's not good. So that's what I want to work. Why the Pentagon is so important. At the end of the day, it's the main reason I was pushing Michelle Flournoy as I was. She understands this stuff and the Pentagon bureaucracy in a way that very few other people do. And this is going to be crucial if we're going to make whatever systems we build are going to be effective. Are we going to, F-35, 20 some odd years later? I mean, I guess it's going to work to some level, but the amount of money we spend on that, we can't afford to do that. We've got to be better about implementing technology.
Right. Well, and we're seeing so much in the area of nuclear weapons where we have to think more broadly than nuclear weapons and be thinking about hypersonics, AI. We have to be technologists across the board, and I think a really new challenge that you have across in that is how do we adapt these technologies that'll be critical to the military going forward, while also processing and thinking through and working internationally on arms control in those areas at the same time.
Right. And one key aspect is, and the way to think about this is we think about what we are trying to achieve. You know, I think a lot of times you get lost in the whiz bang, you know, stuff's like, what's the goal? Okay. And that's the way I always think about things. What do I want? Okay. What is the goal? What is the objective? And then you can go, okay, what are the tools that are going to help me get there? All right. You know, that's a long, complicated story that I tend to tell about my first election campaign, when I thought I was going to have a whole bunch of money and I didn't. And I thought, okay, I refused to quit. So it's like, okay, money doesn't actually decide the election. All right. It's nice to have, but you don't win just because you have more money. Ask a lot of Democratic House candidates about that right now. You win if you get more votes. So then that's what I focused on. Okay. Money helps you get more votes, but there are other things. There are other ways to get votes that aren't really that expensive. That's the way we need to think about it. What's the goal? What's the objective? Okay. And then how can that technology help us achieve that objective? You know, you got DARPA and some other folks that can do technology for technology's sake, and that's fine. But you also need somebody up there going, this is what I want to achieve. What are the tools? You know what? I think that could be helpful to what I'm trying to do here. That way we need to think about it to make sure we're in the most cost-effective way possible.
Well, we're starting to work in. We have about, I think, 7 minutes left, and because I know we need to end on time. And I continue to try to pull together these questions. You know, one that comes across amongst several of our participants is, you kind of eloquently talked a bit earlier about how we need to rely on more non-military tools of influence to kind of shape the security environment in a positive way. And I think there's a few people who'd like to know, whether it's from an arms control perspective or in other ways, what would be the vision for that? In other words, if not military, then what? How should we go about doing that? What should we be prioritizing? Where should we be investing to realize a vision for a world that looks like that, and a U.S. security policy that would, you know, kind of fulfill that dream?
I think we need to do a lot more study on this, but the two things that I would say is, number one, focusing on what I just talked about. What's the goal? What's the objective? What are we trying to achieve in national security policy? You know, it's not to beat China in a war. Okay. You know, it's not like we got a football game this weekend. One's going to win and one's going to lose. So our objective, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. The Seahawks are playing the Jets. Their objective is to score more points than the Jets on Sunday. So let's go try to figure out how to do it. Not to be taken for granted, by the way. But what are we trying to do? And what we're trying to do, I think, and this needs to be fleshed out more, is we're trying to deter our adversaries from destructive behavior. We don't want China to take over Taiwan. We don't want China to gobble up territory that doesn't belong to them in the South China Sea. And we don't want them to force kleptocratic, autocratic government on places in Africa and elsewhere. Okay. Now, you know, one way to do that is to shoot them so that they don't do it anymore. But that's got a whole lot of risk and a whole lot of problems. So are there other ways that we could deter them from doing that? Yes. Alliances. Okay. Partnerships. One example, and there happened to be in Tunisia last February before the pandemic set in. You know, and Tunisia kind of likes us. You know, we get along reasonably well. We've helped them with a couple of things. China's trying to get in there. China would love to be able to, long term, I'm sure, build a navy base on the Mediterranean. All right. So we can defeat China by saying that we're going to build a massive military so they feel like they can't threaten us, or we can build a better relationship with Tunisia so Tunisia decides it's not in their best interest to piss us off and let China have a naval base in the Mediterranean. Okay. So if you invest in a diplomatic relation, it's about persuading people. I mean, to me, it's like counting votes. It's like getting the votes that I've gotten. I'm not going to tell you these stories because we're in the middle of it right now, and I got to get the votes for an override. So I do not want to reveal my secrets at the moment. But you know, when you're trying to get someone to do something, there's a lot of different ways to get them to do that. Okay, who do they listen to? What are their interests? What are they concerned about? What's going to motivate them? You know, yeah, every once in a while you get backed into a corner and brute strength is your only option. It's not a particularly good option, actually. It is far, far better to understand what people want up front and how you can get to a mutually agreeable position where you can get just enough of what you want, and they can get enough of what they want to do where you're at. And that's diplomacy. So that's the investment in diplomacy. That's the relationships. I mean, it is a bit of a problem that China and Russia have become a bit expansionist in their outlook. But at the end of the day, they are still driven by interests. All right. China's got 1.4 billion people to feed. They want to make sure that their economy is clicking. How can we find ways to work with them on those interests and to build partnerships around the world? Frankly, I think that is vastly more effective than getting into an arms race. An arms race is really just a brute strength fight. It's like you can't talk to this person anymore. So all of a sudden you're in the middle of a bar fight. Let's figure out how to talk to each other so that we don't have to get to that point. Because in the modern world, with the weaponry that we have, we can't afford it. And there are plenty of other ways to deter our adversaries and get a more peaceful, prosperous world than simply relying on the military.
Well, thank you. I think that actually is a great note for us to draw the conversation to a close. I really want to thank you for just a terrific discussion, kind of a tour de force. I threw everything at you, as did the participants. And so it's really been a great conversation. Before we close, is there anything else that you would want to touch on? Anything we missed that you would like to talk about?
No, I just think the big thing I want to emphasize, this is an incredibly exciting time, I think, as we move into a new administration and we move into, a new world. When you think of all the technologies available where it's taking us, and I think what we've seen a lot in the last year is sort of the downside of that. The conflict we've had in our own country, the spread of a pandemic that we've been unable to control. But the upside is, all the technology that is out there and all the really, really smart people that we have. I think if we start thinking about the problems the right way, we have a ton of resources to bring to bear. The whole Trump delusion. And I understand where that came from. But I think what we should be optimistic about is once we finally, it's like the old Saturday Night Live skit, the thing wouldn't leave. Once he truly does on January 20th, I think there's an enormous opportunity in a bipartisan way. There are a ton of Republicans as well and Democrats who are anxious to get past the vitriol and say, what can we work on? I'm not Pollyannish here. I know there's still going to be a bunch of people, biting at our ankles. But I also think that there's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, all across the political spectrum, who are anxious for the chance to start thinking about in a logical, practical, cooperative way to address the problems that we're facing. And I am optimistic about that.
Well, that's a good charge to all of us to, keep working hard on these issues, and everyone on the line as well. On behalf of CSIS, I want to thank you for taking so much time and talking through the issues with us today, and for your tremendous leadership here. Good luck on the bill. Hopefully all comes together, and you can move into the holiday season with that behind you, fingers crossed. So thank you also to all the participants and everyone who's been so helpful here. We've really had tremendous support. And I just want to highlight before we totally wrap, Louis Louder and the team, all of your staff who made it possible, Maddie Clough, Susie Clays, and for sure the whole AV team. So with those thank yous, sir, appreciate your time and hope to see you again soon.